At 5:47 in the morning, I woke up to 100 Holsteins turning my grandfather's orchard into a toilet, and the woman who ordered it stood at the road smiling like she was watching fireworks. That's a hard thing to explain to a 911 dispatcher before coffee. It gets worse when the trees getting crushed were helping pay for your daughter's future. My name's Cord Beaumont, and I inherited 7 acres of apple and pear orchard in the Shenandoah Valley from my grandfather Elmer. He planted the first rows in 1962 because that's what men like him did with good ground. They worked it, they fed people from it, they left it better than they found it. I grew up in those rows, skin sticky from split apples, forearms scratched by bark. Hearing bees work the blossoms so loud in spring it sounded like the whole place was humming to itself. It wasn't some picture postcard fantasy. It was dirt weather, busted knuckles, and home. When Elmer died, the orchard came to me, the land, the old cider barn, and about $40,000 worth of things that had been postponed for so long, they were basically waiting their turn to fail. I was working HVAC, then bad back, decent hands. No real farming background, unless you count childhood memory and stubbornness. Most people told me to sell. I told them I'd think about it. I was lying. I was never going to sell. My daughter Waverly made sure of that without even knowing she was doing it. She grew up out there the same way I did. By 12, she could tell a visitor the difference between a wine sap and a Honeycrisp with more confidence than most grown adults. On pick-your-own weekends, she ran the front table, sticky hands, muddy boots, hair half escaping whatever she'd tried to do with it that morning. Every good weekend, every jug of cider, every box of apples, part of that money went into her college fund. That orchard wasn't just property, it was a plan. The trouble started with a certified letter that looked way too important for something so stupid. The HOA around my land. Ridgemont Estates had existed since the late 90s, built around the orchard because my grandfather refused to sell when the developer came knocking. For years, the board mostly left us alone. Then Renata Holloway became president. You know the type. Clean SUV, perfect smile, polished voice, and that very special kind of confidence that comes from spending years bossing people around in conference rooms and mistaking salesmanship for wisdom. She tried to buy me out twice. The first offer was low. The second one came wrapped in language about community standards and long-term neighborhood value, which is rich, when what you really mean is, I want your land and I'm annoyed you know it. I told her no both times. She took that personally. The letter said my cider barn, built in 1971, nearly 3 decades before her HOA existed, was a non-conforming commercial structure. $500 a week until I tore it down or brought it into compliance. I figured it had to be some clerical mess, the kind of nonsense a calm conversation fixes. That was my first mistake. I went to the HOA meeting with a folder printed statutes and the kind of optimism only a tired man can still mistake for strategy. Before I left, Waverly looked up from the kitchen table and asked, "You're bringing the folder, right?" I told her I always bring the folder. She gave me that look teenagers have when they already know how your night is going to end. On the way out, I opened the voice recorder on my phone. I'd been reading late the night before and learned Virginia is a one-party consent state. That little fact turned out to matter more than half the laws I printed. The room was packed, which told me right away I wasn't walking into a meeting, I was walking into a performance. Fluorescent lights, stale coffee, folding chairs, 40-something people pretending they were there to hear both sides. Renata sat at the front in a blazer the color of authority and gave me the floor with a smile that never touched her eyes. I laid it out plain. My barn predated the HOA. My orchard was protected under state agricultural law. The fines had no basis. I was polite, calm, specific. Then a man in a good suit stood up from the back row. HOA attorney. Of course there was an HOA attorney. Renata had spent money on one before she ever bothered returning my call. He had exactly one thread to pull, and he pulled it clean. Years back, during the period the HOA was formed, my grandfather had leased the orchard to a cousin for a while. The attorney argued that created a technical question about whether the land had been in continuous active agricultural use at the exact moment the subdivision documents were filed. He didn't say I was wrong exactly. He said it in that lawyer way where they make uncertainty sound like defeat. Every time I tried to answer, Renata cut me off with meeting procedure. Out of order. Not germane. The chair recognizes. She had memorized the rule book like a woman studying for a test called How to Humiliate Somebody in Public. So I changed gears. I stopped arguing and asked one question for the record. Was my orchard parcel inside the HOA boundary on the official county plat? Not their internal paperwork, not their covenants, the county's recorded document. She dodged it. That told me more than an answer would have. After the meeting in the cold parking lot, an older man I didn't know stepped over and spoke low enough that nobody else could hear. Said his name was Fletcher Oakes. Said he'd been on the original survey crew back in 1998. Then he handed me a card and told me something that changed everything. The orchard parcel was never supposed to be in that plat, he said. Somebody moved the line after I drew it. That was the twist. Not the lawsuit, not the cows, not the drama, that sentence. The next morning I was at the county recorder's office, and by lunch I had the original survey spread out in front of me. Fletcher was right. My orchard wasn't barely outside the line. It was clearly outside the line. Clean, obvious, not even close. I photographed every page and sent them straight to a real estate attorney named Davia Merritt. Best phone call I made that year. Renata didn't back off. People like that rarely do when they still think money can outrun facts. Instead, she filed 3 county complaints at once. One saying my pick-your-own operation was illegal, retail. One saying my gravel lot violated stormwater rules. One saying my cider press was an unlicensed food operation. It was a flood tactic. Bury me in paper. Keep me reacting, make me tired enough to miss the real issue. Bad contractors do the same thing when they know they screwed up. They create 5 new messes and hope you lose track of the first one. Davia knocked them down fast. The farm sales were protected. The lot was grandfathered in. The cider permit was the only thing that had any edge at all, so I cleaned it up and filed. Done. What mattered more was what she found while digging through the paper trail. Somewhere between the original survey and the later HOA filings, my parcel had been inserted into the boundary without a legal amendment, without my grandfather's consent, without any valid process at all. On paper, I was never lawfully in that HOA, not once. Then came the quiet. No letters, no fresh complaints, no little visits at the property line. For a few days, I almost let myself think she was backing down. That was dumb. Quiet from somebody like Renata doesn't mean peace. It means she's loading something. Then one Saturday in late April, I woke up to thunder that wasn't thunder. Hooves, branches snapping, irrigation lines hissing. The smell hit first wet manure, crushed blossom, raw mud. I got to the window barefoot and saw 100 black and white bodies moving through my rows like a tide. Trees my grandfather planted. Trees I'd spent 11 years pruning, wiring, nursing through storms. 6 mature Honeycrisps already down. Drip lines torn open, soil churned into soup. And there she was at the road, white SUV, arms crossed, tiny smug wave. I didn't waste time being shocked. You only get so many useful seconds in a disaster, and grief can wait its turn. I called 911. Then I called Davia. Then I turned on every exterior camera on the property and started narrating what I was seeing into a second recording. I'd installed that camera system right after the HOA meeting. Not because I thought cattle were coming. I'm not a prophet. I just knew in my bones that somebody this committed to control was eventually going to do something stupid on purpose. The deputies arrived fast. They walked the damage with me, photographed everything, watched the footage. And the footage made one thing clear: those cattle hadn't wandered in. They'd been driven in, pushed through with intent by men on ATVs. One deputy looked at the screen, then at the orchard, then back at me, and asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him I wanted the full picture first. By mid-morning, I got it. One of the hired hands came back in a pickup, young guy, pale, looked like his conscience had been chewing on him for hours. He held out his phone. On it was a text thread with Renata. I read the message twice just to be sure my anger wasn't inventing words. Make sure they get into the main rows. I want him to see what happens when you fight us. She had put it in writing. There are people who destroy you quietly, and there are people who get cocky enough to leave fingerprints. Renata left fingerprints, boot prints, tire tracks, and a text chain. After that, the case changed. The civil suit got bigger. The sheriff got the messages. Fletcher agreed to testify. Davia went deeper into the HOA records and found something meaner than I expected. The HOA reserve fund had been calculated for years using my parcel as part of the maintenance formula, even though my land had no legal right to be included. That meant money had been collected and built up off an illegal assumption. Not millions, nothing flashy, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to hurt. So we filed for declaratory judgment that my parcel was never lawfully in the HOA. We sued for trespass and business interference, and we moved against the portion of the reserve fund tied to my parcel's unlawful inclusion. On top of that, a legal notice froze the reserve fund while the case was active. Renata could no longer use the HOA's safety net to finance the war she started. That was the moment the mood in the neighborhood began to shift. See, homeowners will tolerate a lot of nonsense right up until nonsense gets expensive. Suddenly, the same people she'd worked so hard to stir up were hearing about delayed repairs, frozen money, legal bills, rising dues. Board members started asking questions. Neighbors got quieter around her. A few started slipping me information. One anonymous note showed up in my mailbox that said, "You're not alone. Please don't give up." I taped it to the barn wall beside an old photo of Elmer planting the first row. Two kinds of evidence, both useful. Renata still had a few ugly tricks left. She posted lies in the private neighborhood group, hinted my cider operation had health violations, emailed farmers markets trying to get me removed, pushed for an emergency injunction to shut down my fall season before trial. That one almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was desperate. Davia's response, brief, peeled that motion apart so clean the judge denied it from the bench in 12 minutes and openly questioned the good faith behind it. On the record. That matters. After that, her attorney withdrew. Good sign. By the time trial came around, the room was full. Homeowners, a local reporter, board people trying hard to look like they had not spent 2 years backing the wrong woman in Waverly in the second row, wearing the same flannel jacket she used on orchard weekends, like she'd decided to wear her armor in public. Fletcher took the stand and unfolded the original survey like a man laying out a body. Calm, precise, no drama. He pointed to the boundary and said, "I drew that line. I know where I drew it. And I know where someone moved it." You could feel the room tighten. Then Davia read the text messages into the record. Slowly. No performance, no raised voice. Just Renata's own words filling a courtroom full of neighbors who had spent a long time hearing her version of events. That silence, after I still remember that silence. The HOA records finished the job. My parcel had been inserted without authority, without amendment, without consent. The judge didn't need a second day to think about it. He ruled from the bench that my orchard was not and never had been lawfully under Ridgemont Estates' HOA jurisdiction. Every fine, every demand, every claim they had tried to put on my land void from the beginning. A month later came damages. The court awarded actual damages for the trees and irrigation, consequential damages for lost harvest revenue, attorney's fees, and the portion of the reserve fund tied to the illegal parcel count. Altogether, it hit hard enough that the HOA would be feeling it for years. That wasn't revenge. That was math finally catching up to arrogance. Renata resigned before the recall vote finished. The criminal case ended in probation restitution and a permanent record she couldn't smile her way out of. Gus Braddock paid too. No movie ending, no handcuffs on the courthouse steps, just the quieter kind of justice that actually sticks. With the money, I replanted the 6 Honeycrisps and added 4 more. Waverly helped me set them in the ground on a cold November Saturday. She asked what we should call the new row. I told her the Elmer Row. She said he would have hated the conflict. I told her he would have liked the ending. She nodded and pressed the dirt down around the roots. I also took part of the award and set up a small agricultural scholarship at the local community college in Elmer's name. Seemed right. A man spends his life making something grow. The least you can do is keep that going after he's gone. The next fall, we had our biggest pick-your-own weekend ever. Families everywhere, music near the barn, cider moving fast, kids dragging wagons through the rows, the whole place smelling like apples and cool air and fresh earth instead of fear. One of the new HOA board members came through the gate, paid like everybody else, shook my hand and said, "Good apples this year." I told him they were the best in a while. They were. What I learned from all of it is simple, and I learned it slower than I should have. Some people count on you being tired more than they count on being right. They think if they make enough noise, file enough paper, throw enough weight around, you'll hand them your ground just to get your peace back. And maybe sometimes people do. I get why. Fighting is expensive. It wears you thin. It changes the way your chest feels in the morning. But some lines you draw once. You don't move them. So now I want to ask you something. When somebody in power uses rules, money, or sheer intimidation to try to take what isn't theirs, Where do you think the line is between defending yourself and making sure karma gets a full detailed receipt? Tell me what you think, and tell me if you've ever had to stand your ground against somebody who was sure you'd fold.